All right, good morning, everybody. How are you? Good. Quick question before I start. Are there any doomsday preppers in the room? Two? All right. I will offend two people probably with this story then. So when I was in college, I had an internship with this guy, Jim. Jim's a pretty interesting dude. He was my boss. He was also a doomsday prepper, and we worked in a manufacturing facility in Pittsburgh. And Jim would receive these bulk loads of grains and flour and all this other stuff to fill his bunker that he had built in his backyard. He hand-built this bunker by himself, concrete shell, everything, but he wanted to make sure that he could survive through anything. And what we used to call Jim, though, because I mean, other than crazy, we'd actually call him half-assed Jim, because he never went the full way. He never was going to see the full true end of that story. And we hear that a lot, and we see that a lot with disaster recovery plans. They're half-assed. They're halfway done. And what I mean by that is that we constantly evaluate, we plan, we test, but we rarely actually ever have to actually declare that disaster. Knowing this, I have a lot of concerns with DR execution for a lot of customers as well as companies that I consult with. Infrequent tests lead to variable results. They have hours of manual intervention to usually make it work once it's over. It's really difficult to fail back because they never thought about that. And the like systems aren't always available for you to actually fail over to, so it's a 80% DR test. But what if you lived in this part of the map that gets hit with hurricanes? What would you do? Because the chances of you actually failing are pretty good, right? So today we're going to tell a pretty interesting story with one of our customers, and we got some pretty cool video feed coming in with them to kind of tell their story. But this customer lands right there in that map. So last year, when the hurricanes were coming through and battering down Florida, he was right in the eye of the storm. So we'll go through some introductions, a little bit about Expedient, a little about our customer Bouchard Insurance. We're going to talk through some disaster recovery planning tips, give their take on what happened when they were doing their disaster recovery planning, give some tips on designing a solution. They'll give their take on how they designed their solution. And then we're going to actually talk through the fun part, actually, what it was like when they declared a disaster. Because that's the part we really don't know. That's kind of the taboo thing. Has anybody actually ever declared a disaster? Okay, we got a few. Was it fun? No. What do you mean? Why not? You did all the prepping though, right? Right. Let's see what they'll have to say about it. So about Expedient real quick, we have 11 data centers, 7 different cities. We've been doing infrastructure as a service a long time. We built our first VMware cloud back in 2007. DR as a service is obviously a pretty big business for us. We have 1,600 plus customers, and we're one of those Zerto Platinum partners. Now let's see about Bouchard Insurance.
Bouchard Insurance is one of the largest independently owned insurance agencies in the United States, and we really specialize in putting our clients first. We've got about 240 employees, and we service about 13,000 clients with about 31,000 policies. It's stressful. It's a big responsibility. We feel it. IT is one of those businesses where when things are operating great, you kind of are unheard of, and when things aren't working so great, people are knocking at your door. It's a big problem if things aren't going well. Like many organizations, we have a blend of both internally hosted and externally hosted applications. Externally, we have hosted mainly our agency management platform. So this is the platform that we run most of our insurance applications with that interface with our insurance carriers. So the systems we provide out of our internal location here, things that are hosted on our data center, are critical infrastructure to enable our employees to service clients. So one big portion of that is our virtual desktop environment. Essentially, when our data center's down, we have no computers for people to work on. So that virtual desktop environment becomes absolutely critical to delivering service to our clients. Our IT systems are absolutely integral to business operations here. Without them, we can't service our clients the way we like to. We can't service claims, we can't input claims, we can't interface with our insurance carriers. We're really highly dependent on our IT infrastructure here. I came to Bouchard in 2015, and we had a disaster recovery plan in place. We were looking at a recovery time of 48 hours, and it just wasn't good enough for us.
So quick recap on the video, some of the key things that I wanted to make sure you guys all hear. The largest independently owned insurance company based down in Florida. Their big thing is client first, and it truly is. I mean, you can see on their logo, but they have signs all over their office that's what they really care about the most is client first. And you'll hear that as a theme throughout this whole presentation. And their big thing, their big critical system, because most everything was actually outside of their four walls as far as how they're actually interfacing with the insurance carriers, but their VDI was a critical system because that's how every one of their people log in. They have thin terminals at all of their locations and at all of their desks. So let's talk about the disaster recovery planning. One of the big questions we always ask is, what are you protecting from? And it's funny because the things you're protecting from now are constantly changing. Atlanta had no idea that they were going to have to deal with ransomware this year. The one on the right, far right, that's a pretty interesting outage because that was when Square went down. So that's what it looks like when you have to use pen and paper again to try to handle transactions at a coffee shop. And Square is a software as a service, so you got to think that they'd have disaster recovery in place, right? They didn't. And then the bottom one, being the big one, and what affected Florida and Bouchard Insurance was the power outages. I mean, you have millions of people out of power, residential, commercial, whatever. So all those work from home people, they can't really transact business that way. A lot of people always forget about, they always look at maybe these big things, but there's a lot of smaller things that will impact them as well and what you're protecting from. Ransomware probably being the biggest anymore. We've seen it many a times inside of our business as well as in partner businesses that we work with. And big carriers like FedEx even got hit with ransomware. So it's some of those different things that are starting to change. It's probably not going to be the natural disaster if you're not in Florida or inside of that southern coast, or the southern coast there, but it's going to be something else or something different that might impact you. Think about all the software as a service applications that are out there right now. What happens if one of those crashes? What will that impact and how will that impact your business? The other good thing to look at, obviously, is if you've done disaster recovery, is RPO and RTO. And I won't go after this one too long, but just for basis here, because we'll talk about this in the next video. RPO is the actual amount of time or amount of the data you can lose. RTO is the time it will take. And you heard him say 48 hours was his RTO when they were looking at their old disaster recovery plan that wasn't acceptable for them. So defining out what is acceptable for you and your business is pretty key. Now, one of the big things that we always focus on when going through and doing disaster recovery planning with companies is really what's that cost of downtime. And it's funny, reputation now has usually gone above and beyond money, especially with Twitter and the memes that come out. I mean, Delta just absolutely got crushed when they went out and they had their power outage. There's plenty of memes out there like this one about plugging it back in. There was ones where did you blow on it after you took out the cartridge and put it back in. There's a ton of this stuff. So they're sitting there making fun and making memes about these companies. And the reputation is huge. When Southwest had their outage last year as well, I mean, there was a lot of customers that didn't want to go back with Southwest because they weren't able to fly with them when they had a whole computer system down. But the money is also still really, really important. And the money is going to be in a lot of different things, in a lot of different formats. The employee productivity is probably the biggest one. The SLA credits if you're a service provider, what that future sales might look like. What can't you do during that time? And really, what does it feel like when you can't transact? When Square had that outage, I mean, do you think the coffee shop did the same amount of revenue they did that day? Probably not, because they're sitting there writing handheld receipts. I know I wouldn't want to wait 15 minutes for a line to go in front of me for a coffee. One way to kind of figure this out is if you actually check out a website called thecloudcalculator.com, you can actually go in and put some of these variables in there and it'll start to figure out what your cost of downtime is. So we're going to cut back to Brian and we're going to have him give you his take on some of these important things, what he was looking for from an RTO and RPO standpoint, what their cost of downtime was, and really what disaster they were trying to prevent against. Obviously, we know that's hurricanes.
We live on the Gulf Coast of Florida. Our primary concern is obviously a hurricane, and that was the most likely event that we saw happening that we would have to protect ourselves against. When we have a hurricane looming like Irma being here in Florida, it is the most critical that we are up and running because that's the time our clients need us most. They're dealing with the same hurricane that we are, and so they're calling in with their claims, and it's really the time where Bouchard shines as a company. Disaster recovery at Bouchard, we had a good plan, but when we really investigated what was going on, we found that the plan was not really going to give us the RTO and RPO that we were looking for. When we did an analysis, we looked at and thought that probably it would take us at least 48 hours to bring our systems back up if we had a catastrophic failure here in our primary data center. We thought at least 48 hours to come back up, and that just wasn't acceptable for us, wasn't acceptable for our clients, and we knew we had to make a change. The main thing we were really looking for was the recovery time. So we wanted something that was as turnkey as possible and would put us in a position to fail over either proactively or at the drop of a hat and be up and running in a matter of minutes, not days. RPO was probably less than 8 hours is our real objective there. Obviously, the less we can do on that, the better. RTO, we really had probably the same number. Probably 8 hours was our goal, and with Expedient, we were able to exceed that by quite a bit. During our last failover, we were probably less than 10 minutes RTO. The real financial impact of downtime for us, we estimated about $100,000 a day. More importantly than the financial impact to us is what it says to our clients. In the event of a hurricane, that's a situation where our downtime, although it costs us money, the image and the issues that it presents to our clients is much greater of an impact than what we have with our own internal operations.
So quick recap there, right? Obviously hurricane's the big one. Less than 8 hours was their goal, which was, for me, doing this kind of disaster recovery planning, I mean, 8 hours is definitely an acceptable one. The cost of downtime per day, about $100,000. I was a little bit taken aback when he said that, because their existing plan then would have cost them $200,000 if they had a failure, and the chance of them having a failure, pretty good. Right? The $100,000 per day, I did some research on it, that's actually kind of the average across the industry. And there's actually some different papers that are out there that talk about how you can even figure that out. Again, like I said, with the sales that you might lose, the customers' productivity issues, all those other things to kind of figure out what your cost of downtime is. But it's something everybody should definitely take a look at as they're going through this DR planning, because it's something that the executives need to know, and it might actually help you out on some of your budget stuff. The reputation risk is something that we talked a lot about, even offline off the video, as that was actually their biggest fear. External, all of their customers, not all of them, but majority of the customers are in Florida, okay? So if they have a disaster and the customers need to file claims, they don't have anybody to go to, and you're probably not going to keep your insurance with that company for a long time if they're not available for you to actually get help when you need it the most, especially when you've been paying this policy for some of those people 30, 40 years now. But they're internal. They have Bouchard businesses in other locations other than Florida. So they didn't want the internal employees and saying, what the heck, what are you guys doing? Why would you put our data center where a hurricane comes through when we need to transact and run our businesses out of North Carolina, South Carolina, those types of places? So reputation truly was one of their biggest risk factors that they needed to solve when they were actually doing all their DR planning. So let's talk about designing the solution, because this is, I think, probably the part where you can kind of get the most variability inside of your planning that's going to affect and impact your RPO and your RTO. So a lot of people go and look and how will they create their DR plan? They know they need it. There's three major ways that you can do it, in my opinion. The DIY, and the DIY is very similar to this picture. It's something that is in best effort for sure, but it's usually not going to be a long-term sustainable plan, as you need those people to actually go and figure out how to fail it over, how they're managing it. It's probably not the best way for that business to actually go, as that's really not their core focus. You have a hosted provider like, obviously like Expedient and a lot of the other providers that are out there. They're going to be a lot more handheld in a hand-holding situation with you. So they're going to go and work with you. They have experience doing this with a lot of different businesses, and it's going to typically be a higher touch process and figuring out how you actually deal with your technical objectives as well as your business objectives. Tier 1 cloud providers are also out there right now as a DR as a service point. I will kind of create some caution there, because it is going to be something that's very rigid when you actually go and you move and you fail over to there. You're not going to have that high touch relationship unless you're going through a VAR or somebody like that, and that's really more like a hosted provider anyway. It's just a change in end resources. Now, another big part of variability for DR planning is inside of the replication technology. I mean, the core concept of DR planning is pretty simple. move site A to move site B, right? But there's three real main ways to do it. You can do data protection, which is really how we all kind of started this thing, by taking your backups and moving it to an off-site location. You can do application replication, so focus on different parts of the application to figure out how to move just that core data. And then you can actually do group replication, hypervisor obviously, SAN-based as well. Now there's pros and cons to every one of these. On the data protection side, and this is really I think how most people started out their DR planning, it's tape and disk backup, something like that. It's great. So the technology's been around for a long time. The cost is fairly low. It's something that's just really data dependent, so how much data you need there. But the complexity is extremely high because you're booting off of cold data. You have humans that you need at that secondary site. You need to drive them there, fly them there, have them sitting there, whatever it is. And you actually need to have those servers built and then restore onto them. So, yes, this is a form of disaster recovery, but it's probably not going to be the ideal one for you, as your RPO is going to be at least 24 hours, typically with daily backups, and your RTO is definitely going to be multiple days, depending on how many systems, how many sizes, the size of the system is how many people you might have as well. Now you have application replication, and this is something that's still used quite a bit, and maybe it's part of this, and that's going through all of these. Maybe you use all three of them to actually build your plan, but understand the different risks. So the technology there is built into the application already. A lot of Microsoft products already build it in. Oracle has multiple ways to do it for their databases. Cost here is going to be a little bit application specific. Complexity, again, you're going to need those DBAs that are usually wanting to be on call anyway, on call to help you kind of get this thing restored and make it work. Probably not going to be the easiest and the most cost effective at the end of the day. And obviously the group replication, the hypervisor and the SAN, and this is where we see obviously most people going now as the technology has improved dramatically over the last 3 to 4 years, as well as the cost has come down to something a little more palatable, and you can use a lot of different service providers to kind of help you out and do this. But obviously VMware SRM's out there, Zerto, you can use proprietary SAN technology to make this work. Your cost though is going to be high. You're actually paying more money up front to actually build this out, so hopefully you can reduce that complexity in the back end. So to give you kind of an insight on what we built for Bouchard Insurance, it's really a simple two-site platform. They do all of their replication over VPN tunnels, over public internet. They run a private cloud running the VDI environment at their data center that we were actually filming in. So you can see the nice palm trees blowing in the wind. That's kind of what they deal with on a daily basis. It's kind of, I'm jealous. But they run their private cloud there, and then we built them out a private cloud in our secondary site, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. A place that doesn't get really hit with the storms like they do when you're coming into Florida. And our solution design, we have some core philosophies that we try to hold true for every one of our DR plans that we build for our customer. We use the same technology time in and time out. So the big one here, having it a VMware environment, running Zerto replication, having some sort of dedicated replication network. Majority of times we're actually using private networks, whether it's in between our data centers or a private network in between our customer site, but we also use VPN. The big difference here, and the big thing I want to call out, is really the philosophy that we try to take our approach with our DR planning, because it's sometimes different than other people's, is we actually want to try to orchestrate and automate as much as possible in the beginning, during our testing, during our planning, because we don't want to count on humans on the other side. We have no idea what they're going to be doing, if they're going to be available, whatever. We want people to really simplify it out, to push that button, everything's automated, move from one site to the other. So the other side of it too is one of our big philosophies is we do not oversubscribe the resources on the secondary site. What we found when we were oversubscribing some of the resources, people wouldn't do their testing. What happens when they don't do their testing? Well, it doesn't work when they actually need to declare it over. So taking and having those resources always available for people running their testing, we'll have customers go and move it from primary site to secondary site without us even knowing it, and run there for a little bit just to make sure they're comfortable with it, make sure their teams are comfortable with it, make sure all their applications and their users are happy with what their performance looks like. And the biggest one is test always and test often. We constantly tell our customers, you got to test always, test often. When we go through the whole delivery process, we do not let them go to be a regular customer until they've had a satisfied and validated test that their DR plan actually works. So let's go back to Brian. Let's kind of hear some of the things that he thought about when he was going through the solution design.
Ultimately, what we really needed at Bouchard was a disaster recovery system that we're confident in. I'm sure a lot of people would consider building something like this on their own. We did look at doing it ourselves. After all said and done, I can't imagine what it would have been like had we proceeded down that path. Just there's a lot of challenges that go along with this. Specifically with the virtual desktop environment, our infrastructure is even more critical than most. So doing that ourselves and having all the headaches that go along with that didn't seem like a great option. Before we even had a contract together at all, we worked for probably hours on end with engineers at Expedient, planning, talking about their past experience with similar environments, and working through all the technical questions that we had, which was a long list of concerns that we had about whether or not we'd be able to recover, whether or not this solution would fit us, and ultimately Expedient really came through. Cost was a big factor, and DR solutions are never inexpensive. We were looking at replicating almost our entire infrastructure, and it was an important factor in what we did. Expedient was very competitive in the market, and that helped us sway that direction as well. Cost was an important factor, but it certainly wasn't the most important. We really needed a solution that was going to be turnkey, that we felt confident in. Really, the confidence to be able to fail over successfully and know that we were going to be protected in the event of a disaster was the most important factor, and cost probably a close second. Expedient was able to address our concerns on both fronts. So technically, we knew we had confidence in what they could do, and we knew that we could fail over successfully, and they worked with us to structure the contract in a way that made sense for us financially. The process of kind of getting things up and going was pretty iterative. Lots of testing involved in that. The first time we ran through a test of the DR plan, it wasn't a failure, but we certainly had a lot of kinks and things that we needed to resolve. The second pass was a little bit better, and the third pass a little bit better, and a little bit further down the road, we felt rock solid with everything we were doing.
So you heard it from him as well. DIY was not an option, and they said it multiple times that they were so glad they didn't go the DIY route, because again, the people side of it would have definitely caused them a lot of challenges when they actually needed to declare that disaster. Their big thing, again, I think that, and this was somewhat of an anomaly, I mean, they were more focused on the function than cost, which I think a lot of people kind of switch those around. They worry about, getting the best price DR plan that's out there, but if the functionality is not there, if it's not something that's going to work, it's probably not getting the best bang for your buck. These folks, they definitely tested until perfection. I mean, he called out 3 times, but they probably tested 10 times until they had every piece figured out, fully scripted, fully automated to make sure it just worked when they needed to declare that disaster. So let's go back into declaring a disaster, because I think this is the part this was the part that was most exciting for me, in kind of understanding, what he had to say and what their team went through when they declared a disaster. And the biggest thing they talked about wasn't the technology, because they felt that, okay, if we had all that technology done in the solution design and the planning, it shouldn't be actually about technology when they fail over and declare the disaster. They were more focused on the business process, and this was the stuff that I think was pretty interesting. They have a full plan for, who declares a disaster, and that's a question we typically don't ask. If you have it automated and scripted, who's going to push that button? Who's going to be there? Who's the responsible party there? And what's that process? How do you do that? Are you just going to have, one guy, they mentioned their guy, engineer Jay, was he just the one going to be able to decide, hey, we're going to declare this disaster? Or is there an executive process to it? Do you have to get ownership buy-in? Whatever it is, where are your stakeholders there? Define that out. This is the part that I think people miss the most. And another thing to think about, and this is where they were really focused, is where will your employees focus during their disaster time? Right? This hurricane was going and hitting these hundreds of employees that worked at this company. And yes, the company was really important for them. That's their livelihood, but also they had families to deal with. And going into a hurricane, we learned a lot about it, but you're making multiple trips to Home Depot, you're covering up windows, you're doing a lot of things. You're building sandbag walls, you're doing a lot of things to actually protect you, your community, everything, as well as then try to think about your job. And one of the ways that I thought that they looked at it that was pretty good was they wanted to be IT superheroes. They wanted to basically be that team that nobody even thought about it, that nobody even really cared. Nobody thanked them because nobody knew any different when they were running from the primary site to the secondary site. They just wanted to be in the background, kind of in the shadows, protecting the system, having it run, And that was really their key goal. Let the business stuff get taken care of. They'll be in the back end, technology already figured out and already solved. So let's go back to Brian and let's kind of hear what it was like going through the whole declaring the disaster, which happened in September this year.
Our worries when a hurricane's coming are twofold. So on the one hand, we've got to worry about keeping our IT systems up. On the other hand, we've got to worry about our own homes and families. And both are obviously very important. In the event of Hurricane Irma, we knew it was a really large storm. We knew it was headed directly towards the Tampa area. About 2 or 3 days before, we were watching the weather very closely. As soon as we knew this hurricane was coming close to us, we thought it best to proactively perform a disaster recovery failover to Expedient in order to not have a problem going down here. We have a disaster recovery group that meets regularly, and anytime there is a looming hurricane, we've got a team that represents all parts of the organization. In those meetings, we discuss whether or not we want to proactively fail over, whether we want to wait and see what the storm does. We met with our disaster recovery team and we made the decision together that really a proactive failover of our IT systems was the right thing to do. We were really confident. We knew it was going to work. We had done plenty of testing and we felt very confident when we went to pull the trigger that everything was going to work. I think others in our organization that don't know as much about what's going on in IT didn't have tremendous expectations one way or another. What was nice is they never missed a beat. They never really saw anything different. The same environment they logged into every day was sitting there for them ready, even when we were in disaster recovery mode. So I think everybody was really happy with what we did. Once we decided to push the button and perform the failover, our lead engineer, Jay Becker, pushed the button, failed us over, and brought everything up successfully. We tested things after everything came back up and felt like we were in a pretty good shape. The end user really had no clue that we had failed over. As far as they're concerned, they're logging into their desktop just like they always do. Everything they need access to is right there and available for them. They just had no idea that we were in disaster recovery mode. If we pushed the button and things didn't work, we would have been at a real loss and we would not have been able to service our clients. We wouldn't be able to handle any claim calls. We wouldn't be able to do a lot. So it was important that that worked for us. Once the storm was over, there were no parades, no cakes, no giant celebration, but I think everybody, certainly on our executive team, knew the monumental effort that it took to get us there and to make sure that we stayed up through the disaster.
So something to think about while they were going through that whole disaster, this is really what it looked like in Memphis at that time. Pretty significant difference in weather, right? So, kind of some of the final takeaways, because I think you probably got a lot of different information here. If your DR plan is good, you never know when you're going to need it. Make sure it's great. Don't just focus on the technology and things like RTO and RPO. That's kind of the low-hanging fruit. The business process, what it looks like when you're failing over, how you handle failing back, that's actually probably more key and important than figuring out just some of those smaller details. Understanding the cost of downtime is huge. Financial and reputation is a big part of this. They used a lot of that data to understand and sell this to their executive team to make sure that they were IT superheroes. That yes, they didn't get any parades or cakes, but they were definitely noticed that day. Communication between the executive team and IT team are really key. Not just for the building side of things, but actually guiding the execution and the plan. So make sure you're actually working through what that process looks like, what that committee looks like, as you talked about, because that's really, really important once you actually need to declare a disaster. And the best part about it, and this is like my favorite thing, I've been doing IT for a long time. It's an awesome job. It's a thankless job, but that's usually the best days. I never really got yelled at for when something worked properly. But you always get yelled at when something doesn't work properly. So with that, Brian, any last words?
Zerto!
Brian's a fan. It saved his butt in that time, and so he was definitely pretty pumped on it. That was an outtake that he didn't want us to use, but we had to use it. So with that, I still have a few more minutes here to take some questions. If anybody has anything, love to be able to answer it, whether it was about Brian and his systems or anything else about disaster recovery planning. Sir?
So what was their
So they're targeted RTO and RPO. They actually were, like he said, 8 hours, and when it failed over, their RTO was about 15 minutes, and the RPO was in the seconds range when they were moving it from Florida to Memphis. Since it was a clean break, though, I mean, they didn't lose any data, and everything came up clean on the other side.
Did they use DNS changes, or did they keep the same IP?
Yeah, so they use DNS changes, and we do disaster recovery planning both ways. We'll actually do move the public IP using BGP to fail it over when available, if they have their own address space or if they're running inside of our data centers. This, they just did DNS changes. Yep. Who else has a question? Failback? So failback for them, the process, you want to know about the process or? Yeah, so the process for them, it was, you know, they hit obviously, they failed back the Zerto side of things back into their sites. We ran into some challenges on, you know, the time it took to bring that over. One of those being is that we use all flash arrays inside of our data centers. They had spinning disk there, so we were running into performance issues where we were sending more data than their SAN could actually receive at one time. And so that's something we're going to fix in the future because you know, they don't want to wait as long to actually bring the failback. But they did it inside of a weekend window, so it wasn't horrible, but it wasn't optimal by any stretch of the imagination. But those are things you learn along the way. Put an all flash array on their side, no issues then. We'll be back good. Sir?
Two questions.
Sure.
What did you actually do to fix the throughput issue to make sure they could replicate and fail back? And then the second question being, what was the expectations for the rules in regards to whether or not, I guess they were their own insurance company, but that they could write off the money that it cost to keep things at their DR site?
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so you have two questions there. So how do we fix the throughput issue to bring it when they're failing it back? And the second one would be, you know, what did they put a claim in on their insurance company when they ran on the disaster recovery site, right? So to fix the throughput, we actually didn't do anything because there was nothing we could do because we would have to replace the SAN. We just had to let it wait. And one of the other things we did do is actually we took the NAS out of the scope of it and then did a NAS copy another way, and that was actually a lot cleaner that way, and we were able to get it done inside of that change window. So we just had to kind of modify it on failback. But again, if they replace that SAN, we don't expect any issues when they actually do the failback into it the next time. It was where we were basically just choking out the SAN. They had plenty of bandwidth there. Now, on the insurance side of things, did they file a claim? So they didn't. Their costs, the way it works inside of our world is they only pay for what they consume as far as licensing and VMware resources goes. So their bill wasn't really that high for running inside of our world for a few days, and it wasn't worth a claim, really. Yep. Sir?
Was their DR test the same workflow and process as the actual failover?
So the question is, was their DR test the same workflow as their actual DR failover? Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they're testing not in like a bubble?
Yeah. They do testing in the bubble for sure, but they've actually done real failover tests to run in Memphis and then to bring it back. The difference there was that the time that they would run in Memphis and bring it back was very, very small instead of days, and that's where the data built up, and that was a little bit of a challenge when you had to bring it and resync it all the way back. Yeah. So we learned a valuable lesson there. Sir?
For the VDI environment, are you replicating actual desktops or?
So they did a few things, yeah. So they have some persistent desktops that we need to replicate, and then they have linked clones as well. And then they have a whole bunch of other virtual servers around it that all support it. So things like a NAS filer, AD servers, that kind of stuff. Any more questions? Sir? So the question is the total amount of data replicated. It was about 15 terabytes. So fairly small environment. Yes, sir.
Where are the U.S. data center locations?
So we have 7 different cities, 11 data centers. Boston, we have one here. Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Memphis. And we actually partner with some other different data centers that are out there, and we put our cloud services in their data centers depending on where the customer might want them. We just rolled our first one out in Australia, Montreal, and Frankfurt. So we're all over the place now.
Have you been involved with unplanned DR failovers?
So the question is, have I been involved in unplanned DR failovers? Yes, quite a bit. In 07, 08, 09, we spent a lot of time. The one we did was pretty crazy. A company in Pittsburgh, they had flooding in the city, and they had all of their data centers pretty close to the river, and we pulled tapes out of there and did a manual restore. It took us about 3 weeks to get everything back up and running. But they were a pretty big engineering shop. They didn't have any hardware at the secondary site. They just had tapes for us. We had to find tape drives to even restore the stuff. It was pretty bad. But we've done some others too. I mean, we've had power outages in people that we were talking to and we were in relationships with as far as prospect goes, and where they just had a production outage at their site. We set up card tables the one time, brought servers in, and they brought their servers in, powered up inside of our data center until we could get the rack set up. So, yeah, we've had a lot of interesting ones over the years. I like when they plan for them a little bit better than that. Yes, ma'am. So the question is, if there's the primary site, just all of a sudden it's crashed, it's down. The same way, so I mean, we would fail over those Zerto replication groups, and all that data is being replicated all the time over there. So the problem you would have then is just how much data you lost there. And typically with Zerto, if you're a customer, you know this. I mean, it's usually sub 15 seconds of data that you might lose, and in most companies, that's definitely enough time that they'll take that little risk, especially when a lot of stuff gets stored in transaction logs and everything. It actually will fail over then and be brought up at the secondary site faster than the 10, 15 minutes that it took them because it doesn't have to worry about crash consistency. It's down there. It doesn't have to shut anything down. It's just going to start firing up servers at the other side. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you for your time today. I appreciate it. If you could go into the app and fill out the survey, the Zerto team would be happy about that. Thank you.